If you listen carefully, you can hear the sound of rain outside and songbirds. I just finished painting one of America's most iconic songbirds, the American Cardinal. And when I say American, I mean North and South America, because there are 3 kinds of cardinals found in the Americas. Anyway, I'll explain that in my video. So this is Cheryl, the artist of Animal Art by TerraCotta, and I do painting tutorials. And this is a picture that my friend asked me to paint, and while I was painting it for my friend, I decided to make a tutorial for other people to paint along with me. And so in this tutorial you can find the method of how to choose a picture, how to transfer the picture to your canvas, the paints and the brushes involved, and the step-by-step process. And if you take the tutorial, I would really appreciate it if you would make comments in the space below, because I would love to hear back from you. Before you begin painting, you have to identify the pictures that you want to illustrate. So I went on Pixabay, since I don't have pictures of cardinals, and I found 2 pictures that I really identified with. One was a female, just like the cock of her head, and then I found a complementary male. But for the male, I had to do a flip on him since he was facing the right. I wanted him to turn to the left, kind of to be harmonious with the female, but that was not difficult because I can use some online software. So now I have my pictures and I can prepare my colors and canvas. These are the colors that I use. You're not constrained in any way to these colors. I would recommend, however, the yellow ochre, or if you don't have yellow ochre, then raw sienna will be fine. A red, a cobalt, burnt sienna, or some kind of darker brown, just to get your darker colors, since you're dealing with birds and you're putting a lot of browns on. I did use a yellow to brighten the red, and you'll need lots of white. I only used black one time during the painting, and that was around the eyes and around the bill, and that was it. Otherwise, you're using blues to darken your colors, or maybe even the burnt sienna. You have a choice of many brushes. I do recommend an angle brush, kind of a 1/2 inch or 3/4 inch, a couple small round ones for those details, and then some wide ones for laying down some thick color. Not pictured here is the gel medium. I used it to dilute the paint instead of water. What it does is it dilutes the paint, makes it kind of transparent, makes really great glazes. And if you use water instead of the gel medium, then you have a running mess. And so I prefer the gel medium. You're still using a touch of water, but heavily the gel medium. It's optional and just a hint. Unfortunately, I made a mistake with the black transfer paper. I didn't allow the base coat or the gesso to dry long enough. I should have waited several hours. It felt dry to me, but it wasn't, and so when I was transferring my image, I actually smeared a lot of the carbon onto the canvas, and I had to repaint my canvas entirely. That was a big waste of time. So even though I'm using the black transfer paper, I'm trying to create a very light line so that it's not going to affect my painting, because my background is so light. It does affect me as I'm painting later on because I can barely see it, but that's for the next stage. When we block in the colors, we'll be using that outline. Barely see the lines. I have to be really careful where I'm painting. So I'm hesitating a lot as I go. Also, there's a little bit of a glare because I'm keeping my canvas flat. It's for the video's advantage, for your guys' advantage, but not mine as I'm painting. You'll also notice that the paints are quite thick. I had just buttered them up. I just mixed them and they're just not going on well, but this is okay because this is the first layer. I'm just blocking in the color and I'm trying to get the idea of where the shapes are going to be. I pre-mixed those colors, and you'll later see me mixing colors, so you'll know how to do that if you have that question. I'm not being hyper careful with this first layer, but I am trying not to go beyond the lines because this is a light background, and if I go beyond the lines, then it would be really hard to clean up any kind of like extra lines there. The brush I'm using is an angle brush. It's incredible for getting sharp edges, little corners, this kind of little flat detail work. I love this brush. I believe it's a 1/2 inch or a 3/4 inch angle. And I'm in Korea, so you don't get this brand here. But anything, yeah, this is a Wahong. Any angle with springy fibers is what you're looking for. You just want to be able to get those sharp lines. It doesn't matter the brand. So you can tell there's a big difference between the male and the female colors. The female cardinal has a lot of browns, touches of red, but not near the brilliant red that is in the male cardinal. So you'll see that not only are the feathers different, but the feet coloring are different, the coloring around the eyes, and even the tail feathers. So I mix different paint pools when I'm painting the different birds. There's one thing to consider when you're painting animals and birds. Animals and birds are soft looking usually. They have fur that's very soft. They have feathers and that's also soft. They don't have hard edges. So people who are painting them or drawing them oftentimes make the mistake of putting a hard edge around their bodies. So you'll see that my male cardinal right now seems to have a hard edge on the stomach or on the breast. This will disappear. It's only in this first layer, but something to keep in mind as you're painting, because you don't want that hard edge to make it look like a comic character rather than a realism or a realistic painting or drawing. One thing to remember when you're painting is to retain the white. You don't want to put down paint everywhere. If you leave some white spots, you can glaze over those later, and that glaze will make a harmony with what you've painted and that white, and it will look really natural. So just retain those white areas and you can paint them in later. Once you've got your base colors blocked in, then you can start adding a little bit of a different color to add more depth and value and texture. It's this color that you're going to paint the textures on later. This is like another foundation or base. And because we're doing feathers, you will need to have a darker base because the feathering will be a little bit lighter. So a little bit about the cardinal itself. They are songbirds and they are long-tailed. Quite recognizable about the tail though is when they're sitting up in their trees, they don't put their tail out behind them. Their tail is almost always tucked, not at a 90-degree angle, but downwards toward the earth. And this is very unique to the cardinal. Males, of course, have distinctive red markings, and they have black mask and throats also. The females tend to be pale or brown, but their pale coloring is reddish, and that's why we're putting a lot of red in this picture. They have warm reddish tinges in their wings, their crest, and their tails also. And the juvenile cardinals are similar in color to the females. What is unique about them is their bills tend to be gray to black in color, whereas a mature bird, both male and female, will have reds, oranges, and yellows on their bill. It's just a sign of their maturity. And this is true of many birds. As they mature, their bill changes in color. The reddish brown that I'm painting on the tail right now has been darkened a little bit with the cobalt blue, and that's why you see a hint of purple there. This is a really good way to add a shadow without adding black, so the colors stay very luminous. This is probably my third layer, and there could be 3 or 4 more layers. So just plan on having multiple layers, but very thin amounts of paint. You will have a richness of color there that you wouldn't have if you just had 1 or 2 kind of opaque layers. I am actually mixing in a fair amount of gel medium. You can't see it, but you will later. But I'm blending that in with the paint. That's why you see I'm buttering the paint a lot. Buttering means I just swish it back and forth, back and forth. What I'm doing is I don't want it to be dry. I want the paint to flow smoothly. And so if I butter the paint, then it flows very smoothly off my paintbrush. And I find that gel medium buttered into the paint really helps. I also add a touch of water, just a touch, because that helps kind of lubricate all of the paint and the fibers of the brush also. A light, slightly purple glaze really brings out the tufts of the head and the wings. Later, those wings and the tail are going to be a little bit different. They'll be richer in color, a little bit darker. And so right now I'm setting the stage by making some purples there. I don't want them to be brilliant red like the chest, like the breast is going to be. And for the female cardinal, I'm doing a light glaze with the yellow ochre. But yellow ochre, there's a little bit of opacity there. And if you mix white with it, it's going to be even more opaque. So just remember to keep that one quite thin when you're glazing. And the gel medium helps keep that thin. Right now, I am buttering my colors together and I'm also marrying them, which means I'm kind of using a dirty paintbrush or a mixing brush to get the colors blended naturally together. And I'm not using extremely different colors. I have an ivory yellow, yellow ochre, copper, burnt sienna, and then a carmine. And all of these colors eventually get slightly mixed together so that when I paint with them, I don't have to worry about them being too bright, like straight red on top of the cardinal would be too extreme, or the same with the blue. And so here I'm making patches of many other kinds of married colors so that I can just quickly dip my brush, roll it, and then paint. And I really like how the blue mixes with the browns and the reds. I cannot get a black with this blue and red, which is the reason I needed black one time during this painting for a little bit of feathering around the eyes and the beak and the bill. But for the most part, I am just marrying all of these colors and using a rather simple palette to create this entire painting. And one thing I didn't mention was the two whites on my palette. They're not two whites. There's one white. The one that's closest to me is the white, and the one that on the far right is the gel medium. And I would mix both of those in sometimes when I was creating these blends. The gel medium, I don't need a whole lot, but I do need enough so that it would butter the paint up without me having to use very much water. And again, the water is just to wet the brushes, the bristles on my brush. The tail feathers on the male and female cardinal are starting to really come together nicely. They've got shadow in their feathers. There's a hint of texture and play of light. And the white that was retained will be glazed over and it will look really sharp. I'm buttering together a lot of the tans and yellows and browns, some of the lighter tones, and I'm planning where to put the branch for the cardinals to be sitting on. I don't want it to be straight across, and you only get one chance to put your branch down, and it's best, as in Asian painting, if you drag your brush one time and then do a little bit of touch-up. And that's what I'm trying to do. Now I can put just a shadow down. The reason I chose to put the branch at this kind of an angle is I wanted the female cardinal to be a little bit more squatting or sitting slightly lower on the branch, and the male to be showing a little bit more leg and to be more upright. If their bodies are in the same position and the heads are turned the same way, and maybe their legs are also in the same position, it's just not the idea of a well-planned picture. And this way I have a little bit of height, and their heads are turned a little bit differently. And while the paint of that branch is still very, very damp, I'm dragging a darker color across on the lower part to give it kind of a shadow to make the branch look a little bit more rounded. And then I have this dry brush. It's a dollar store cheapie, one of my favorites. It doesn't shed and it's very soft. And I softened the shadow a bit, and actually it came out looking very much like wood grain. I was very pleased. And later it was just a matter of touching up some little areas to darken it, but it was already pretty good looking, if I can say so myself. I got lucky on that one. I hope everyone else does too. And now I'm starting with a lighter glaze on top of the darker red of the male. That lighter glaze is very thin, but it's starting to make the colors pop on the male. And of course I'm going to put darker reds on top, but this is the base for giving it some kind of feathered texture. If and when I touch the red small strokes of feather on top, you will see this lightness underneath. This is how to build a lot of the depth in your paintings. I'm doing the same with the female, and the female was a little bit harder because she's brown, and I was having some trouble getting some texture on her that looked reasonably nice. I kept fiddling with her coat, with her little jacket. I think because her coloring was much more subtle, it was harder to find those distinguishing characteristics. It all had to be subtle with just very fine feathering on the outer layers of her little coat. Anyway, I did a lot of fiddling with her. The male was much easier. He was a bright, brilliant color, and it's kind of like coloring a ball. You find a bright area and a dark area, and you color it. Well, some more useful information about our feathered friends here. Cardinals don't migrate. They don't tend to fly long distances. They flutter a lot like the sparrows. Sparrows flutter from bush to bush to bush, and the cardinals don't do it quite so much bush to bush, but they don't make long treks and long migrations. They tend to stick around through the winter, or they do stick around in the winters. They're found frequently in backyards, parks, shrubby areas, and in fact tend to be around where people are because people feed them. People put out bird feeders, and cardinals are one of the types of birds that really enjoy eating at the bird feeder. So just keep putting the layers on, thin ones. Try to vary the colors a little bit, and always consider where the shadows go. And while I could put some color on, I can take a dry brush and take some color off. It comes in really handy for putting down just a stain on the paper or the canvas, and then removing the excess. I do that a lot, especially for the bill. Think about where the highlights would be, or where the light is reflected off of the bill. And actually I'm calling it a bill, and it's a beak. A bill is what's on a duck. Oops. Just so we know that there's a difference. And the beak on the female is a little bit darker than that of the male. Part of it is her head is turned a little bit and she's not catching the light as much, perhaps. And also her bill is her beak. Her beak is a little bit more muted than that of the brightness of the male. Not much, but just a little bit. It makes a difference. The fan brush is one of my favorite brushes to use, and I use it heavily when I do animals. It's really good for getting the fur texture and for getting the feathers on the bird. And I can also get a very long sustained line with it, provided I've buttered my paints really well and they flow. But the fan brush I can flick, and I do that a lot with the tufts on the head. But you could flick a lot and you can get a long, light, thin, very fine streak of paint. It's really wonderful. You just saw me try to pull several of the fibers apart from the fan brush. What happens is when the fan brush gets damp or too wet, the fibers start to clump together, and then you can't get those fine feathery marks on the breast of the cardinals, or you just can't feather with it, and it tends to clump, and that's really not good for your painting. Because acrylics dry so quickly, I'm constantly pulling the threads of my brush apart. I just don't want clumps of paint on my canvas, and that's very likely to happen when the paint is too wet or it starts to get dry. So now that we have the colors blocked in, we have the values determined, and a lot of the cool and the warm areas, and like I said, the values. So now it's time to start putting in the texture. And you'll notice that suddenly the face appeared on these cardinals. Both of my iPads flicked off. I had no idea, so I lost about 10 minutes of footage. Unfortunately, that's the really important time when I was painting around the face. To give a little bit of background, around the face is not black at all. It is a lot of the cobalt blue used with the reds and a little brown to make it look kind of black. Then I flicked a little bit of black in just some of the edges and for a few hairs and fibers. But for the most part, that is blue with reds. And a quick comment on the color I just mixed. It's not only white, it has a little bit of ivory yellow. And the reason for that is I don't want to have the extreme white because I can't make any highlights off of it. So if I have a little bit of a yellow in there, then I can put in a spot of white in some area to give it an extra highlight. And that way I could have a wider range of values on my paper. It's the same when you brighten an eye. You cloud the eye and then you leave one little spot or two little spots for like the reflection. And that little reflection really accents or brightens the entire eye. You're probably wondering why I keep putting layers and layers on the tufts of the cardinals. It's because if you did only 2 layers, for example, white first and then red, it would be very obviously flat. You wouldn't have any depth. You wouldn't have any whites and reds overlapping each other, suggesting depth. And the same with any kind of fur. And that's why I keep putting the layers down. Also on the breast and around the wings, I put many kinds of layers, and sometimes I don't like it, and frequently I'm putting a thin layer of a glaze on top. But through that thin layer, you can still see the lines, and there were dark little fleck marks, and there was white, and there was some reddish brown. You can see that very subtly through the glaze. And even though you don't recognize it overtly, the mind is picking it up. And if the mind is picking it up, the mind is sending you the message that this is great art, or this is mediocre art, or it's flat art. And this is what you don't want. This is what we're avoiding, is flat art. And that's why I put layer upon layer down. I'm often using two brushes. One has the paint on it, and the other is a little bit fluffy and very dry. I paint the color, and then I just lightly fluff it with the dry brush. And that can either soak up the extra paints, or it prevents hard lines from happening, which is usually the reason I do that. But it's a really effective way to have several little dry brushes to use. I use it with the larger brushes too, having extra ones for fluffing out the backgrounds, because whenever you put like the background down, you sometimes leave a trail of brush lines. And so using a very large, we call it the mop brush, that will fluff out the differences. And I just use a lot of like the dollar store makeup brushes just because they're so cheap. The mop brushes are quite pricey. If you really look closely, you'll notice that the glazing on the tail feathers I just did was not a darker color, but a lighter color. So far, I've had a little bit darker color down on the tail feathers, and this time I brightened it with a little bit of a yellow glaze. And it actually made the feathers look shiny, and it just put a lot more depth there and glow. You know, many people, when they think about painting, they think it's all about painting on the canvas. Probably painters spend more time mixing colors than they do with their paintbrush on the canvas. It's just really important that you get the right colors, you marry the colors, you get the consistency, you water it down, or you add whatever solvents if you're doing oil. But it's really a lot more time consuming mixing the colors than it is, I think, to paint. And I've heard other people say that a lot too. I've already said that cardinals don't migrate. Where they live, though, is in the eastern and the central parts of the US, but that's only referring to the Northern Cardinal, and that is the one that I am painting right now. So the Northern Cardinal is very bright red, but there are two other cardinals, and the other one that's most like the Northern Cardinal is the Vermilion Cardinal, and this one lives in South America, most specifically in Venezuela and Colombia. It has the brightest plumage among all of the cardinals and the longest head crest. Very striking. It kind of lives in the dry, scrubby deserts and the subtropical areas along the northern coast of South America. The third cardinal is the desert cardinal, and it lives in the arid southwest of the US and Mexico. Its coloration is rather dull, and it actually looks much like a robin with a very reddish, orangish breast, but it doesn't have the remarkable red plumage of the cardinal, the Northern Cardinal, or the Vermilion Cardinal. This cardinal is a native of South America, of the southern part of South America, and it is one of the birds that has been introduced successfully into other societies. For example, it's been introduced to Hawaii and Puerto Rico. It has the same red crest as the cardinal, but otherwise it's very dull, and it has a gray back and kind of a white breast. And here's a fun piece of trivia about the cardinal, which I'd never heard before, but I just found when I did a little internet search. A cardinal is often associated with good luck, and many people believe that when the cardinal lands in your yard, some loved one departed is now returning and is near you. While I've never heard that, there's a saying that goes with that too. When a cardinal is near, an angel appears. Well, how comforting is that? Back to the painting. Right now I'm drawing in several berries. I'm just ad-libbing, trying to figure out where I'm going to put them. I give it a lot of thought though, because I noticed from several pictures on the internet that the berries can hang differently. I do want gravity to pull them downward. I don't want them bouncing off in weird directions, when I put in the stems. Also, when I'm drawing in the berries, I'm thinking about what is close to me and what is far away. If it's close to me, I'm going to have a higher value, and I'm going to later make that deeper and darker. The ones that are further away are going to be a little bit more pastel. I'm not going to define them as much. Also, I do want to keep in mind that they need to overlap some, and that is also what shows depth and distance. a little comment about darkening those berries. You can't darken the berries by using just red. It just doesn't work. Red will be a single color and it will be flat. No matter how many layers you put on top, you'll get a little bit more depth, but not a whole lot. So to give roundness and depth to those berries, I actually put a copper brown or the burnt sienna down, and not straight. I mixed it with some of the deeper pinks and reds. And by putting that down in just one area, like a reflected area, I was able to paint a slight glaze on top of that, and that unified all of the color, and it actually made the berry look rounder. Building depth. This is actually the stage that I call for kind of evaluating the composition. How is the composition turning out? What are the values? Am I retaining the whites? Am I getting enough darks down? Do I have textures? How do I like my painting? Are there weaknesses that I see that I can fix easier at this point than I can later? also one of the big things is I was looking at those berries, and somehow it's just not looking well balanced. The berries aren't hanging like they're hanging with gravity, the ones on the right especially. And the ones on the left look a little bit sparse. So, I mean, it takes a long time to paint a few berries because you have depth and you have to think about, the arrangement and blah, blah, blah. But I do need a few more berries there. In both sides, I do need more berries. So that's what I'm doing right now. I don't know about you, but I have never really looked at the feet of a bird before. And so while I was painting this, I did notice a very unusual pattern. We are all familiar, I think, with the footprints of the birds in the snow. They have 3 foretoes and 1 rear toe. And while you're painting the toes of a bird that, when the toes are curled around the branch, they look a little bit different. The middle toe is, of course, hyper long or super long. They all have very long toenails, all 4 of the toes. And 2 toes are in particularly very tightly up against each other, while the 3rd toe could be off just a little bit. And I think this has to do with balance. And another comment about male and female. I don't know if this is regular or if this is unique to these 2, but the male here had a bluer cast to his feet, while the female, of course, had the reddish-orange glow. You'll notice here I'm spending a lot of time painting the cardinal's breast. If you pay really close attention, you can see that my colors are different almost every time. I'm building up different layers of color. I started with kind of a yellow ochre background, and then I slowly built it up with a little bit more burnt sienna, some rose colors mixed in, and different blends. And you saw my palettes of different blended colors. So that's what I'm doing, back and forth, and it doesn't really matter that I paint on top because it's not a heavy paint, and it's okay if those colors blend as I flick on different layers of feathering. The final layers are kind of yellowish, and along the reflected areas of the cardinal's breast, I'm touching up with a little bit of white. So we've accomplished quite a lot, and it's now time for those finishing details. The details that take it from a pretty good painting to a much better painting. It's not going to be like ultra professional photorealism, but it will be quite good. So what some of the stages are getting the contrast, getting those values in. So you'll see me use, some of the darker colors, and I'm very specific about using white. I just put a lot of white supposedly behind and through the crest of the female. And I will do it more on the right side of their bodies, just to kind of put more light there and to put a little contrast between them and the background. I'm using the fan brush to scoop under the puddle of white paint. On the surface it's rather dry, but if I kind of dig my fibers underneath the surface, then I can get quite a bit of paint that's still pretty fluid. Right now I'm putting a lot of texturing on the cardinal's breast, particularly the females. The male, I do try to get a lot of texture, but for some reason it's the female that has more texture showing, probably because she is a little bit duller in color, so I'm wanting to capture some of the light and the variation of the textures because there's not much else I can capture. Sometimes some of the feathering might be a little bit bright, and if it gets bright I can just glaze over it again, or I can rub a spot out with my finger or a tissue. It's not a problem. Acrylic is so forgiving. If I make a mistake, which I have before, especially with the background when I smudged it, then that was a bit of a problem. but it was achievable and very solvable. In the spaces on the tail that I negative spaced, now I'm cleaning up. I'm making sure that it's all very neat, highlighting parts, adding a little bit of white in some areas and just lighter glazes in others. Also, I'm going around the tail if I see any spots or any kind of roughness, because I want that tail to be pretty close to perfect. The feathers on the tail are very straight and they're not fluffy, so any kind of spots or aberration will really show. The tail feathers are very sleek, and that's the goal that I'm aiming for also. Along the branch, the lower parts of the body, I'm just trying to make things smooth and look very finished. I'm adding touches of highlight, and here I'm adding a little bit of a shadow because the cardinal has its body away from the light, and the branch is also putting a little bit of a shadow. So it needs to be a little bit darker where the body is near the branch. For the female cardinal too. But her colors are more orange and a little bit more glowing. I'm adding shadows along each of the toes, and not all areas, just around like the knuckles, the toenails, just some spot areas, and that's supposed to make it look more accented. It gives it a more 3D look. I'm avoiding lines that are very pronounced. If you want to make the lines look good, add a line and then soften it and let it disappear, and then add another. Think about where the reflection would kind of obliterate some of those lines, and that is what realism looks like. Well, this is not exactly realism, but it is realistic. So I'm trying not to have hard lines or pronounced lines. I want lines that blur and blend and become dark and pronounced at times. I want variation. And it's all about capturing the light with those kind of lines. I'm sure you've seen in the winter when birds are cold, they tend to fluff themselves up. And this little bit of air that's trapped between their feathers and their skin is actually insulating them from the cold. Well, in the picture for this male cardinal, he just was fluffier. And he had a lot of finer feathers around his wing area. They gave him a little bit of a baby, endearing look, and it's something that I wanted to capture in this painting. To me, probably the most important part of any animal or human drawing or painting is the face and the eye. If the eye looks angry, or if the cheek is pinched, or anyway, the eye is the soul of the animal or the human. And if the eye looks clear and sharp, then the animal or the human will be great. And so the angle of the eye, maybe how the brow is, or the feathers around it, or the colors around it, or just the shapes. These little subtle differences can really make an impact on the viewer. And that's why I spent a lot of time with my eye here. The female eye, I had a little bit of trouble getting the animation I wanted. I got it quite successfully in the male, but the female, it took me a lot of fiddling around. I had to rework a lot of the brow, And I had her brow a little bit too dark. The darkness was creeping up too high. And her bill was shaped really funny at first, and I couldn't figure out why she looked a little bit off, like her angle was off, and it's because I had twisted her bill. Anyway, I reworked that, and then it was fine, I think. When you look at the cardinal, you know that it's a seed eater. It has a very thick, short beak, and that beak is designed for cracking seeds and nuts, eating berries and the seeds inside of them. The diet of the cardinal is basically fresh berries, sunflower seeds, safflower seeds. They love blueberries, mulberries, blackberries. They like suet. They love peanuts. And they will eat cracked corn. They do not like the mixed bags of seed that many people buy. A lot of birds don't eat a lot of it because it has a lot of filler. Another interesting fact about the cardinal is that they are monogamous. In the wintertime, they tend to flock together in large groups, probably because of warmth. But in February, they start to break off into breeding pairs, and they breed for life. Both parents take care of the young, and if a mate dies during the wintertime during the flocking season, the surviving mate will break away from the flock. Here, I'm dry brushing. I'm using a purplish, and I'm putting a little bit of shadow in different spots. A lot of the areas I'm putting the shadow is right beside the white. If I put the shadow beside the white, it makes the white look more extreme, it pops it, and it actually starts to really build up that 3D effect. With that eye, I'm lightening, I'm darkening, I'm reshaping. I'm trying to put a little bit of light around the eye so that the blackness really pops. There is less black feathering around the female's eye. I just have to keep readjusting until it looks nice. My opinion is shape is the most important. Shape determines a lot of the emotion, especially with the eye, as I said earlier, the pinching of the cheek, or the narrowness of the eyebrow or something related to the facial features. So getting the eye right and the facial features around it is really important. So the shape is really important. Then I would say the values. And maybe the color after that. Not that I'm establishing an order, but I really think that shape determines the majority of whether it looks decent or not. So here her bill is, and I'm trying to get the highlights on it like I did for the males. But somehow the highlights just aren't looking right. It's not looking like a correct beak. It took me several minutes to figure out that I had actually put the line that separates her upper and lower beak a little bit too high, just a fraction of maybe a millimeter or two, and lowering that just a little bit, wow, it made a huge difference. It's amazing what just a small little touch of dimension will do. After I adjusted the positioning of her beak line, then the beak was looking okay to me. And just some last minute adjustments on the soul of the animal, which is the eye. I hope that this has been a meaningful experience for you. Since you're still here, you're listening to me talk about this now. And I would really appreciate it if you would make a comment below, especially if you painted something. Tell me about your experience, or if you learned something. I would really love to hear that. If you would like more or a certain animal, please make a comment below, because I'm making a list and checking it twice, I guess. And I would love to paint more animals that people are interested in taking tutorials on. Thank you for watching, and I hope to see you again.